In our first two sections of this chapter, we covered the three major factors that determine the climate on Earth, which were insolation, albedo, and greenhouse gases. In this section, we're going to go into a bit more detail on how different forces and events can and have changed Earth's climate over the course of its geological history. And we're also going to talk about the current climate period that we're living in and which forces have been the predominant ones shaping climate in Earth's recent history. So, the first one that we'll talk about is greenhouse gases. So, as you now know, greenhouse gases absorb heat and prevent it from escaping out into space. They can be both naturally occurring and man made. So, the big naturally occurring greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, and water vapor. And then humans also emit other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxides and CFCs, and they also contribute to the output of carbon dioxide and methane. And one very important point that we want to take away about greenhouse gases is that a tiny amount of them can cause large effects. So you may remember from our previous chapter on atmosphere and air pollution that 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, 21% is oxygen, and neither of those are greenhouse gases. So 99% of our atmosphere is oxygen and nitrogen, and then the remaining 1%, out of that 1%, greenhouse gases only account for a fraction of that 1%. Carbon dioxide is the biggest one, and it only comes in at 0.04%. So the bottom line here is that greenhouse gases make up a small fraction of the atmosphere, but they still have a big impact on keeping the Earth warm. So what may seem like very small changes in the concentration of those greenhouse gases actually amounts to significant consequences for the heat absorbing capacity of the atmosphere. And another thing to note is that for many greenhouse gases, changes in the concentrations happen quite slowly, at least in terms of human timescales. It's estimated that it will take 1,000 years for natural processes like photosynthesis and ocean absorption to remove the carbon dioxide that has been produced by human activity till this point. Other greenhouse gases won't take as long to cycle through the atmosphere. Water vapor gets removed after just a few days. Methane takes about 10 years to break down, and CFCs take about 100 years to break down. Another force that has impacted Earth's climate by changing albedo levels is the activity of volcanoes and asteroids. So, volcanoes have both a heating and cooling effect on the climate, depending on whether you're looking in the short term or in the long term. So, eruptions release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is, of course, a greenhouse gas. And so, in the long term, this enhances the greenhouse effect and warms the climate. However, in the short term, and by short term, we're still talking on the order of months or years, these same eruptions release ash and sulfur, which causes the climate to cool because it increases the albedo of the atmosphere. So the ash and sulfur block sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface and instead cause the sunlight to reflect back. Large asteroids also have a similar effect because of the large amounts of ash that they kick up into the atmosphere. And because of this, both volcanic activity and asteroid impacts have historically caused mass extinctions. Mass extinction is a period of time where at least 75% of species go extinct. So, volcanoes and asteroids pollute the atmosphere with so much ash that the lack of sunlight can mean that plants don't actually have enough light available to them to perform photosynthesis. And because plants are the producers and the foundation of the rest of the food chain, it can cause the whole food chain of consumers that depend upon them to collapse and lead to these mass extinction events. Another factor that affects Earth's climate is clouds. So, kind of like volcanoes, clouds have this duality. They can both warm and cool. They increase the albedo of the atmosphere and reflect light, which of course causes cooling. But they are also composed of water vapor, which we know is a greenhouse gas that can trap heat and then act as kind of like a blanket for the Earth. Which effect you get from a cloud cover depends on the type of cloud, the height of the cloud in the atmosphere, and also what time of day it is. So, for example, during the day when the sun is out, clouds typically provide albedo and therefore they have a cooling effect. But during the night, Those clouds are no longer reflecting solar energy, and they are predominantly causing a warming effect. So, as our climate continues to change and temperatures go up, climate scientists predict that there will probably be fewer clouds, and that could make temperatures more extreme, both more hot during the day, because you don't have the clouds there to moderate the solar radiation with their albedo, and also colder at night because you don't have the clouds there to insulate things and keep things warm. And then two other forces that have changed Earth's climate are first biological organisms. So we've talked about how living things perform metabolic processes that either consume or release carbon dioxide and oxygen, and this does have an impact on the extended atmosphere. For example, you may remember us talking about the Great Oxygenation Event in previous chapters, where cyanobacteria, which were the first organisms to perform photosynthesis on Earth, were responsible for generating the oxygen that we have in our atmosphere today, as well as through that process, consuming significant amounts of carbon dioxide. And then finally, characteristics of Earth's orbit, tilt, and spin have strongly influenced patterns seen in Earth's climate throughout its history. We'll get into those more in just a bit. But at any given period in Earth's history, each of these various forces have played a different role or have been the predominating force in dictating the Earth's climate and what that looks like. So, what about today? What about our current geologic period? What has been determining climate during our current period? Well, the current period that we're in is called the Quaternary, and this period is defined as spanning from about 2.6 million years ago up until the present day. So remember, humans have only been around for a little less than 200,000 years, so the start of the Quaternary predates us by a long shot. Climate during the Quaternary has not been static. It's been characterized by alternating glacial and interglacial periods. So during glacial periods, ice sheets have covered much of the northern hemisphere, while during interglacial periods, those ice sheets recede and the climate is warmer. Right now, and for about the past 12,000 years, we have been in an interglacial period that is referred to as the Holocene. Okay, so what has caused the Earth to oscillate back and forth between these glacial and interglacial periods during the Quaternary? There are three big forces that have caused this ebb and flow. One of them is orbital changes, which are gradual variations in the shape and size of Earth's orbit around the Sun. Also, tilt variations, which are gradual adjustments in the angle of the Earth's axis. So you may remember from the last section that we're at about 23 degrees right now, but we haven't always been and we won't always be. The tilt changes over time. And then finally, greenhouse gas dynamics. So in other words, changes in the concentration of heat-absorbing gases over time has also facilitated the glacial and interglacial periods. Scientists estimate that there have been about 30 glacial interglacial cycles in the past 2 million years. And we're going to look at how each of these three variables brings about the alternating glacial and interglacial periods. But before we do, let's talk about how we know this. What is our evidence? Because after all, the Quaternary has been going on for 2.6 million years, and humans have only been around for a couple 100,000. So how can we know this? We know this by relying on sources of information called proxy data. And proxy data is information gathered based on preserved characteristics of the environment that can serve as a substitute for taking direct measurements. Obviously, we cannot directly measure what the temperatures on Earth were millions of years ago, but we have geological relics of those times available to us that can tell us that information. One very important source of proxy data is ice sheets in polar regions. These are huge areas of permanent ice that have existed for extended periods of Earth's history. The areas they exist in are so cold that they don't melt seasonally, and so they're preserved over time. And these ice sheets are formed from seasonal snowfall that gets compressed into ice over time, and then more snow falls on top of that layer, and more snow falls on top of that layer, and so on, such that the deeper layers of the ice sheet correspond to the oldest ages. And to give you some perspective on how far back this record goes, the bottom of the Antarctic ice sheet is about 800,000 years old. From these ice sheets, ice cores can be extracted, and ice cores are long cylinders of ice that are obtained by drilling down, sometimes quite far, sometimes several miles down. And those cylinders of ice contain many layers reflecting various depths and periods of time from the past. And knowing the fact that the deeper you go, the older the ice is, we can estimate the age of a particular layer of ice. Um, because the ice cores, as you see in this image, they can be stratified into visible layers, kind of like tree rings that represent each consecutive season of snowfall and freezing. And then looking closely at those layers, scientists can infer what the climate conditions were like on Earth at the time that the layer was formed. And they do this by looking at variables such as the temperature of the ice, the properties of the water molecules that the ice is made of, the dust particles that are trapped in the ice, and also gas bubbles that are trapped in the ice. So let's talk more now about the type of information that these different variables provide. We'll start with what we can learn from the properties of water molecules that make up these ice core layers. The chief property of water molecules that provides information about climate is their mass. So, not all water molecules weigh the same amount. There is this natural variation in the weight of water molecules because these molecules can contain different isotopes of oxygen. So, you may remember from chapter 2 that isotopes are variations of an element that have the same number of protons in their nucleus, but they have different numbers of neutrons. So, in the case of oxygen, which is one component of water, H2O, O is the oxygen, there are two oxygen isotopes that can bring about different weights in water molecules. Oxygen 16 on the left is an oxygen atom containing 8 protons and 8 neutrons. You can see that labeled in the center with 8p, 8n. And then oxygen 18 on the right is an oxygen atom containing 8 protons and 10 neutrons. So oxygen 18 is a bit heavier than oxygen 16. And this difference in weight affects the way that water molecules containing these two different isotopes behave in the atmosphere. In the case of oxygen 16, which is lighter weight, oxygen molecules that have this isotope of oxygen, water molecules that have this isotope of oxygen more easily remain suspended in the atmosphere as water vapor because they aren't as heavy. And by comparison, water molecules that contain oxygen 18, the isotope on the right, are more likely to condense out of the atmosphere as precipitation because they are heavier. So, in the grand scheme of global precipitation patterns, the oxygen 18 water tends to condense out as rainfall over middle latitudes of the planet, while the oxygen 16 water remains aloft and can make the journey through the atmosphere to the polar regions, where it falls out as snow and turns to ice. However, some of the heavier oxygen 18 water does make it to the polar regions, and the specific amount of oxygen 18 water that makes it depends on how warm the Earth's climate is at the time. So during warm climate periods, there is more heat energy in the atmosphere, and this heat energy helps keep the heavier oxygen 18 water to remain suspended. During cold climate periods, without that extra heat energy, the oxygen 18 water is more likely to drop out as rain in the middle latitudes before it reaches the poles. And this means that when you're looking at a specific layer in a polar ice core that corresponds to a specific time period, and you see a higher proportion of oxygen 18, this means that the climate must have been warmer during that period when the layer of ice formed. When you see less oxygen 18 in the water in the ice, then the climate must have been cooler. This figure here shows you historical temperature records that have been extrapolated based on this oxygen isotope analysis method going back 450,000 years. So you can see the axis on the horizontal axis on the graph on the left goes back 450,000 years. The black dotted line, or rather lines, represent our current temperature today for a point of reference, and the blue and green lines represent the temperature data that's extrapolated from two different sets of ice cores collected in Antarctica that were drilled out of sites located about 350 miles apart, the Epica site and the Vostok site, which you can see marked in red dots on the map at the right. And as you can see on the graph, these two independent samples of ice core data taken from separate sites agree with each other very closely, and they show repeated parallel fluctuations in Earth's temperature over time. And this graph doesn't display it, but you can even look at ice cores that are even farther apart, like ones from the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and they agree with each other. And on the left-hand graph, there's also the red line on the bottom. Red line corresponds to volume of ice. And for this one, if you look at the labels on the vertical y-axis, you'll see that low ice volume is they actually put it on the top, and high ice volume is on the bottom, so opposite of what you might normally expect. But you can see how as the global temperature goes up in the green and blue lines, as that were taken from the oxygen isotope data, the amount of ice represented in the red line also trends toward being lower because it's warmer and there's not as much ice formed during that period. So the isotope data sets agree with each other, and it also agrees with the amount of ice volume that's seen in the ice cores. Two other pieces of information that we get from ice cores, other than the oxygen isotope analysis, are dust particles and gas bubbles. So dust from geological events like volcanic eruptions gets incorporated into the layers of ice, and this can offer a richer picture of other factors that may have contributed to changes in the climate around that point in time. So in the ice core pictures that you see on the screen here, you can see a very clear volcanic ash layer in the middle of the cores. And in addition, scientists can use the amount of dust in a layer of ice to determine how dry versus how humid the air was on Earth at the time, based on the principle that dry air is known to carry more dust than moist areas. Also, as snow is getting compacted into ice, tiny air bubbles get trapped in the layer, and those bubbles preserve a little sample of the atmosphere from that time period in Earth's history. And we can actually look at the gases contained within the bubbles and figure out what proportions were different gases in the atmosphere at the time. And these analyses show us that periods with a higher concentration of carbon dioxide correlate with higher global temperatures that is extrapolated from the isotope data. So this figure here shows on the top in blue, the blue line shows temperature changes over the past 50,000 years of Earth's history, and the information shown in the blue line has been taken from the oxygen isotope analysis. And then in the green line below it is the concentration of carbon dioxide that is observed in the trapped gas bubbles in the corresponding ice layers with those oxygen isotopes. And again, as you can see, there's a very strong correlation showing higher carbon dioxide concentrations being associated with higher temperatures. And then the red line on the bottom is the dust particle concentration, which remember is not an indication of temperature, but an indication of how dry versus humid the air was at the time. One final related piece of evidence to talk about while we're on the topic of ice cores is ocean sediment cores. So ocean sediment cores are long cylinders of sediment material that get drilled out of the ocean floor. And like ice cores, they contain various layers spanning different time periods. With ocean sediment cores, however, they cover an even longer time period than ice cores. So instead of looking at a time scale of hundreds of thousands of years, like in ice cores, ocean sediment gets deposited over the course of millions of years. So the geologic and climate record that we get from ocean sediment cores spans the entire Quaternary period and beyond. And when we do isotope analysis on those ocean sediment cores, we again see an oscillation between warm and cold periods, glacial and interglacial periods. And we also see that over the past 3 million years or so, the Earth's climate has been on an overall cooling trend on average, but there are still very dramatic swings between warm periods and cold periods. And right now, we are in a warm period. So this gives you a picture of some of the ways that we know about what climate has looked like over Earth's history and how we know that the Quaternary has been marked by these alternating glacial and interglacial periods. In our next section, we'll look at the specific ways that changes in the characteristics of the Earth's orbit have facilitated this alternation between glacial and interglacial periods.